Last night we had a number of very interesting primary results on both the Democratic and the Republican sides that shed some insight on where the electorate is in terms of the November election, and basically a sorting out that's been going on in both parties when it comes to the far left progressives in the Democratic Party and even MAGA Republicans in the Republican Party, as there were a number of Trump-endorsed candidates that lost in South Carolina, Utah, and Colorado. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So obviously, we're going to start off with probably the most hotly contested primary of the entire evening last night, and that was New York's 16 congressional district. Now, this was a pretty vicious primary on both sides. George Latimer, the county executive of Westchester County, successfully primaried out Jamaal Bowman by around a 17-point margin, and we still have votes to be counted as of the recording of this video, but 88% of the vote is in. Latimer captured 58.4% of the vote to Jamaal Bowman's 41.6%. Now, the biggest issue in this primary by far was the conflict going on in Israel-Palestine. Jamaal Bowman was seen as on the fringes of the pro-Palestinian movement, and his rhetoric in a lot of cases came off extremely poorly to your median voter, and in some cases sort of incited a lot of nasty things. So Jamaal Bowman really was on the far left anti-Zionist side of the spectrum when it came to the Israel-Palestine debate. And in theory, most of Democrats around the country support a ceasefire, but Jamaal Bowman, I think, took the issue a lot further in a lot of his comments, at least to some voters in New York 16. So that's the way it came across. And ultimately, voters responded very harshly to that. Now, George Latimer is pretty much a standard Democrat. He kind of reminds me a bit of Tom Suozzi, but I guess any Democrat looks pretty moderate compared to Jamaal Bowman, since he was probably one of the most far-left Democrats in Congress. So he's successfully been booted out by Democratic voters. Again, if you look at the county breakdown of the district, Westchester County makes up most of the district, 63 to 37% margin for George Latimer. Really no surprise there because he is the county executive of Westchester and he's fairly popular. He's known as somebody who can cross the aisle and has made a name for himself in the county. So the fact that Westchester County makes up most of the district already put Jamaal Bowman at a pretty large disadvantage. And in fact, almost all of George Latimer's votes came from the Westchester County portion of the district. 43,064 votes for George Latimer in Westchester County. In the Bronx, just 1.3 thousand votes. So you can see a massive difference of these two segments of the district. Now, unfortunately for Jamaal Bowman, the Bronx makes up a pretty small percentage of the district. And even though he won it overwhelmingly, 84 to 16, ultimately it meant very little in the grand scheme of the primary, as the vast majority of the district was in Latimer's favor. So this really was a rejection, I think, of some of the left-wing progressive rhetoric from those in the squad. Now, it's interesting because some people have taken this to believe that the progressive movement that really kickstarted in 2018 when you had AOC winner primary in the 14th congressional district, that was sort of the catalyst for this sort of progressive movement. And then you had characters like Jamaal Bowman, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, all sort of primary out or fill in for more mainstream Democrats. And Jamaal Bowman won this seat back in 2020 after he primaried out Eliot Engel. This was sort of on the back of the whole BLM movement. Eliot Engel was seen as sort of out of touch, not really caring about the district, and Jamaal Bowman used BLM to sort of catapult himself into this district. And then obviously in 2022, he won re-election fairly easily, 64-36. And then, of course, now is losing the primary. So George Latimer is going to have no problem winning the general election in this district. This district is a safe blue district. It's not really competitive. But this primary really exposed the deep divides between sort of the pro-Israel faction of the Democratic Party, which is most Democrats in Congress are marginally supportive of Israel, and then sort of the far-left anti-Israel segment of the Democratic Party, people like Bowman, AOC, basically members of the squad for the most part. So this was really a pretty stark rejection of not really just the, anti-Israel policies, but more so the optics that Bowman brought to the debate. Because I think most Democrats are a bit critical, at least, of Israel's response to this whole thing in the Middle East. But I think Bowman took the rhetoric to a much hotter, extreme tone, and I think a lot of voters were just uncomfortable with that. So While some have determined this to be sort of the death of the progressive movement or the beginning of the end of the progressive movement, I think it really just depends on which congressional district you're talking about, because AOC's district is much more progressive than sort of Westchester County, which is much more wealthy, much more middle class. And, you look at inner city districts as well, like Ilhan Omar's, Rashida Tlaib's. These are districts where those progressive politics are very popular. But in a place like Westchester County, really not popular to be a progressive Democrat. They're more so of the vein of mainstream establishment, quote unquote, Democrats. So I really just think when it comes to far left progressives, it really depends what district you're actually running in. Because if you're in a safe blue district that's in a pretty urban area, you're probably going to be very successful continually winning renomination and winning re-election. But, Jamaal Bowman, unfortunately for him, didn't have the luxury of being in that district. His district was moved up to a much more suburban area. Now we'll move on to sort of the Republican primaries. We'll start off in the state of Colorado. One of the districts where one of the Trump-endorsed candidates lost was in the Colorado Springs district. Jeff Crank easily defeated the Trump-backed opponent 66-34. Now, I haven't really followed this race in particular, but this goes to show you that in some cases, Republican voters disregard what Donald Trump says in terms of a primary and just vote for the candidate that they like better. Sometimes it's the candidate more conservative on policy. Sometimes it's the more moderate Republican. You had Lauren Boebert, who, basically carpetbagged from the western portion of the state to the eastern portion of the state because she almost lost District 3 back in 2022, and I think she didn't want to repeat that. So she moved to a safe Republican district and ended up winning the nomination there pretty comfortably, 43-14, her nearest challenger, with 94% of the vote reporting. So Boebert, I guess, made a pretty smart political calculation, realizing she wasn't viable in the more purple 3rd district, which I shouldn't even say is that purple because it is a Trump district, and I think it is a high single digits Trump district at that. But Lauren Boebert is just so toxic with normal voters that she has to really just move to a much safer Republican district in order to win. And even in this district, there are some polls showing that she is quite vulnerable, which is pretty alarming because this is a very Republican district. And in fact, we had a special election in this district where you had Greg Lopez easily defeat the nearest Democratic challenger, 58.3 to 34.6. So this is a super Republican district, but again, somebody as controversial and unpopular as Lauren Boebert with sort of mainstream voters is probably going to make this district a lot competitive than it otherwise should be. So that's in Colorado. We'll move on to South Carolina. We had another Trump versus generic Republican matchup. You had Sherry Biggs defeat Mark Burns, the Trump-endorsed candidate, by 2 points. Now, South Carolina isn't exactly an anti-MAGA state by any stretch. You had Tom Rice, I believe, who was in the congressional district around Myrtle Beach. He voted for the impeachment of Donald Trump, and voters responded very harshly to that in 2022. I think he lost to his primary opponent without it even going to a runoff, because I think the primary opponent or the current occupant got around 51% of the vote. He got like 25%. So he was punished for snubbing Donald Trump and voting for impeachment. And, this district, I really don't know if it came down to so much anti-MAGA sentiment as it was more so just voters preferring Biggs over Mike Burns. Now, finally, we go over to the state of Utah, which is pretty notorious for snubbing Trump-endorsed candidates. John Curtis, who is sort of more in the vein of Mitt Romney, easily defeated Trent Staggs, the next runner-up, by 20.7 percentage points. Now, this is not surprising in the state of Utah at all. Many Democrats are either independents or register as Republicans and vote in GOP primaries. So the fact that John Curtis won by this much of a margin really shouldn't be that surprising. A lot of independents and a lot of Democrats voted for him, sort of putting him over the top. But you can't really discount that there were some Republicans that obviously had to vote for John Curtis. Trent Staggs was the Trump-endorsed candidate. He was much more conservative, much more America first than John Curtis. But ultimately, the Mitt Romney wing of the Republican Party prevailed because of the fact that Utah has open primaries and allows Democrats to register as independents and vote in the GOP primaries. You also had Spencer Cox, who was the incumbent governor. He's sort of very liberal on the gender issues and things like that. So a lot of Republicans wanted to punish him for essentially being a Democrat on those issues. And ultimately, he won 56-43, again, on the backs of Democrats. If you take a look at the counties where he lost, these are the reddest counties in the state. Phil Lyman getting 77% of the vote in some cases, winning by double digits in a lot of these counties. But you go to historically bluer counties like Salt Lake City, 65-35 loss for Lyman. Provo, 54-46. Again, Provo is a very red county, but it is a very establishment Republican, more moderate county. And as a result, Lyman also losing there. Morgan County going to Phil Lyman very narrowly, but then Davis County, again, population center, 63-37 for Spencer Cox. So, Cox is a much more moderate Republican. I'd say he's probably the most liberal Republican governor, given the partisanship of his state. And, the voters of Utah, independents, Democrats, and some Republicans helped to renominate him to a second term that he will easily win in November. Now, these results sort of indicate, I think, that voters in the primaries are sort of becoming more, at least, we'll take it party by party. Obviously, for the Democrats, I think a lot of big money was able to sway the race in the direction of Latimer. AIPAC put $20+ million to defeat Jamaal Bowman. But I think it also was sort of a rejection of more fringe progressive ideas that aren't really that popular with the mainstream population. And I think that was something you saw in New York, even back in 2022 with Kathy Hochul almost losing to Lee Zeldin. That was mainly because she was very liberal on the issue of crime, and voters punished Democrats by giving Republicans the House in New York and nearly toppling Kathy Hochul. So that, I think, is the message on the left-wing side of things. I think voters are looking for more stable Democrats that are more willing to work across the aisle. Again, Tom Suozzi is somebody I think of as a perfect example, because I think Democrats are realizing that these progressive candidates, had they run in more swingy seats, more purple seats, they would easily lose. And a lot of these Democrats really haven't gotten much done in Congress, really aren't sponsoring bills, so they're really not doing a whole lot anyway, more so just making the Democratic brand more toxic to your average voter. Now, on the Republican side, you do see Trump still having an outsized influence in primaries. We had the Virginia 5th primary about a week ago where Bob Good, who was one of the most conservative Republicans in Congress, lose his primary to a Trump-endorsed candidate who was more towards the center. So in some cases, depending on the state, you still have a segment of Republican voters that will blindly vote for a candidate as long as they're affiliated with Donald Trump. Tonight was sort of a rejection of that to an extent. Again, we saw 3 higher profile Trump-endorsed candidates lose. But again, Utah is sort of a special exception because you do have a lot of independents and Democrats voting in the primaries. South Carolina, though, and Colorado, I think, are a bit different. I think that's more the electorates being a bit more moderate and in some cases more strategic than the national Republican electorate. But this sort of segues into where I think the Republican Party goes from now until 2024, because I think Donald Trump has a critical decision to make in terms of his vice presidential candidate. Donald Trump needs to pick somebody who balances out the GOP ticket. He's more on the MAGA populist wing. You need somebody who's more establishment, more of a steady hand, and honestly a better communicator and more intelligent. Picking somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy would make the election a lot more difficult because, if anything, Vivek Ramaswamy is more fringe than Donald Trump, and I think just hurts the ticket with some of his proposals. You need somebody like Marco Rubio, Glenn Youngkin, even Doug Burgum, I think, is sort of a harmless candidate, although I'm not really quite a big fan of him. But, that's something we're going to talk about in a video later this week. But who knows? I think Donald Trump is expected to announce his VP pick very soon. But anyway, those are the key takeaways from the primary elections of last night. Leave your thoughts down below. Let me know what you think about these primary results. As always, again, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below, liking this video if you enjoyed. Again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.